Good afternoon, class. My name is Bismark Amofa, and I'm presenting on the topic Logistic Network Design in an Era of Supply Chain Disruptions, Strategies, Innovations, and Challenges. So we are going to look at the introduction to this presentation. We will also be looking at the drivers of disruptions, some resilient strategies. We are also going to look at some enabling innovations, challenges and trade-offs, and then conclusions and recommendations. So what is logistic network design? The strategic configuration of facilities, warehouses, transport links, and inventory positions to move goods from suppliers to customers. Logistic network design is one of the key strategic issues in today's supply chain. Many businesses for decades have been designing such network primarily to cut costs. If you look at the old logic, that is to minimize costs, offshore production, lean inventory, single source supplies. However, the fragility of logistic networks that were primarily built for efficiency has been revealed in recent years. The reality is that disruptions have exposed lean networks are fragile. Resilience must balance cost with continuity, flexibility, and recovery capacity. This essay proposes to shift the focus of logistic network design from cost minimization to the resilience-oriented logic. What we should know is that it is not the end of the importance of cost, no. Instead, it is a balance of continuity, flexibility, visibility, and recovery capacity with cost. If you look at this analysis here, what it means is that $10 billion a day was lost during the Suez Canal blockage. We also had 9.7 million vehicles unproduced in 2021 due to the semiconductor shortages, and also 42% lower stock returns for firms experiencing supply chain disruptions. So we are looking at the resilient way of getting a better systems as backups when the reality of disruptions happens. So we'll be looking at the transport evolution dynamics.
It was a strange feeling, walking into the local supermarket only to find empty shelves. And most notably, no toilet paper. We didn't have raw material shortages or manufacturing defects, and we didn't discover new uses for toilet paper. It was panic buying by everyday people. Supply chains just couldn't keep up, and before we knew it, the rumored shortage became a real one. You remember that, don't you? Well, maybe not, because I'm not talking about COVID-19, I'm talking about the great toilet paper shortage of 1973. And it wasn't caused by a pandemic, but by a joke told by Johnny Carson. But today's supply chain challenges are no joke. Those problems are real, but they're problems that we've faced and even solved in the past. A supply chain is the long and often complicated journey that any item takes before it winds up in your home. Raw materials are mined or grown and sold to various suppliers. Those suppliers sell them to manufacturers who transform those raw materials into finished goods. And those finished goods are moved around the world by distributors and carriers, who in turn sell them to retailers, who sell those to consumers as a final step. Many supply chains are simple, like when you buy strawberries at a local farmer's market, but some are almost infinitely complex. In my 14 years working with companies on improving their supply chains, I've seen many disruptions, from natural disasters to pandemics and geopolitical instability. And every time, the media talks about how, from this point forward, companies can and will make their supply chains more resilient. And the common prescriptions include diversifying risk, better forecasting the future, and building buffers like stockpiles of inventory or more manufacturing equipment. And this is good advice. But the question I keep asking myself is, why haven't more companies taken this advice? The reason is that it doesn't stand up against competing priorities and steep competition that occurs between the crises and shocks. So if we want to build more resilient supply chains, the that can withstand the next great crisis, then we need to bring new ideas that can withstand competitive pressures. Let's talk about sharing risk, radical transparency, and automated recommendations. These three ideas, if we take them together, have the potential to help break the trade-off between resilience and efficiency. An obvious solution to supply shortages is to build more buffers so that if anything happens along the supply chain, the next recipient isn't waiting empty-handed. Retail stores can never perfectly predict what we'll buy, so they carry extra inventory. They might run out of a particular size or a particular color, but it's unlikely that they'll run out of an entire category, like jeans. But we know across industries, companies carry less of that backup inventory than they used to. And we have immense product variety, but much of what we buy is made in highly specialized or automated factories. And that makes it harder to repurpose that capacity when demand changes. That's why during COVID-19, those toilet paper manufacturers had enough capacity, but they didn't have the right kind of capacity. Commercial toilet paper is very different from what we consumers use at home. They could have met demand, but it would have meant shoppers lugging home rolls that are 9 inches wide and clearly designed for cost, not for comfort. Streamlining supply chains is a big reason why we consumers have incredible choices at low prices. And for many companies, warehousing extra raw materials or keeping idle equipment on the factory floor is simply too expensive. Competition is steep as it is. But buffers matter in a crisis. So how do we get similar benefits, but in a different way? We can share or pool risk. It's much like a well-established industry that we all know well, insurance. It's unlikely that you'll ever get into a major car accident, but if you do, it will be horribly expensive. That's why for low probability, high impact events, we share risk. And in some instances, like car insurance, we even require it. We could do the same thing in supply chains. Industry players could team up to share the cost of keeping extra raw materials, key components, or even machinery in exchange for an ongoing shared fee and only to be used in times of a crisis. For example, many countries stockpile important medicines, but relatively few keep their active ingredients or APIs. Pharmaceutical companies could share the cost of storing extra APIs during normal times. Then, in a crisis, drug manufacturers could dip into that supply to avoid running out of these important medicines. Again, it's just like insurance, except instead of pooling money, we're pooling a physical resource. And importantly, it would be paid for, and so not seen as pure waste. But in order to do this, we need to know who shares the same risks. And in order to know that, we need a radical improvement in supply chain transparency. Right now, seemingly everything we want to buy is delayed because of a lack of microprocessors, even cars. But how could the auto industry, arguably the industry that invented supplier collaboration and supply chain visibility, be caught by surprise? Microprocessors power the computers that increasingly make our cars work the way they're supposed to. And early in the COVID-19 pandemic, auto manufacturers canceled orders for microprocessors out of fear that car sales would plummet. And around the same time, demand for those microprocessors in consumer electronics went way up. Parents bought tablets so their kids could learn from home. Newly remote workers bought laptops. Then a fire at a chip plant meant fewer of these microprocessors were even being made. And by the time car sales began to recover, microprocessors were in backorder. In other words, the reason why automotive companies can't get the microprocessors they need has little, if anything, to do with the automotive industry. And this is a good example of a broader problem. In supply chain, your risks are not tied only to your customers or to your competitors, but also to those companies who are using the same inputs. I doubt Ford considers the PlayStation 5 to be a competitor to the F-150, but in this case, they could have been competing for the same scarce resource. And that's why we need a radical improvement in supply chain transparency. It's not enough to know who your suppliers are. You have to know who your suppliers' suppliers are, where those suppliers get their raw materials, Who else is buying from those suppliers? And who else is competing for those raw materials? Often what looks like several unrelated product lines can be traced back to a single source. We think we have diversified supply chains, but we don't. We have a supply web, and if key players in that web fail, then many supply chains are in big trouble. If we want more resilient supply chains, then we need accurate, up-to-date maps of key inputs and where they come from in any given industry. Supply chain managers are fundamentally planners. They analyze and interpret information, and they revise their plans to efficiently meet expected demand with a steady stream of supply. Supply chain control towers bring all of that information into one place. And better data should help better decision making. But too much data can simply be overwhelming, and that's why we need technology to help us. The good news is that advances in data mining, artificial intelligence, and machine learning increasingly mean that computers can help us analyze thousands or millions of points of data, predict problems before they arise, notify managers, and even recommend actions to take. Right now, some types of plastics are in short supply. Plastic resin manufacturers decrease production dealing with...
So, if you listen carefully or if you watch the video that we presented, it was simply about the transport evolution networks, where the presenter used the COVID-19 pandemic as an example. What he meant was that the old systems, where every focus was about minimizing costs and lean inventory supply systems, he used the COVID-19 pandemic as an example because when it happened, all those systems failed. That's the reality. Disruptions exposed these systems, and all that he meant was that we should have a resilient way whereby in such occurrences, companies will be able to continue with their productions, and then where even if there are effects, the effects will be minimized. It shouldn't always be about where systems are built just to cut costs, just to provide some lean systems. No, we should rather look at more resilient way of creating continuity, flexibility, and having a more recovery capacity in the event of such crisis. So we'll be looking at conceptualizing resilient logistic networks. So as I said before, the traditional design focus, it has always been about cost minimization, lean inventory, single source suppliers, long global supply lanes, centralized warehousing. However, disruptions are always a reality. And when these disruptions happen, it brings about long lead times and it amplifies risk, demand volatility, compound shocks. You see, logistic network design is considered an optimization problem in stable environments. The firm wants to design most cost-efficient network that will minimize the transportation inventory, facility and handling costs while ensuring required service level. But disruptions alter the character of the design problem. A warehouse can effectively be used in normal time, but dangerous in event of a single point of failure. Hosseini designed supply chain resilience as the ability to withstand disruptions, adjust to altered circumstances, and restore performance. It implies that firms have to be responsible enough to plan networks that have alternative service points, backup capacity, and routing options. It is not enough to have a network that functions only under ideal circumstances in a non-ideal environment. You see, so if you look at this presentation here, if you look at the conceptualizing resilient logistic network design, the resilient network goals is always to be able to withstand and adapt, to be able to create a backup capacity, to always have alternative to every system that is being designed. There should be visibility across the tiers and fast recovery performance in situations that is what unplanned for. Example as used in the video, like the COVID-19 pandemic. So the next on the presentation is the key drivers of supply chain disruptions. And the first one is globalization. What globalization always seems to do is that it gives companies the opportunity to larger markets, right? Larger markets, access to niche suppliers, and bigger markets. On the other side, it also impacts the lead time and the number of actors involved in the delivery of goods. A disruption in one place could impact production, transport, and delivery and in another place, and that is described as the ripple effect. We will also be looking at the lean and just-in-time practices. You know, what this does is that it always cuts waste. This practice, what is that? It always cuts waste because production or supply is being done on customer demands. But the reality of this is that when a situation happens, when a disruption happens, there's always zero buffer. And the impact is always there on the companies that uses these lean and just-in-time practices. We also will be looking at demand volatility. With this one, the speed, unpredictability, and fragmentation of consumer demand have increased. They want delivery of their goods to be quick. They always want to have variety and the ability to combine fulfillment with other options depending on the customer. So the next disruptions of supply chain is demand volatility. You know, as suppliers, they always want their goods to be delivered on time, quick. All right, they always want variety with speed, accuracy, and everything. But one thing we should know is that disruptions can easily happen, and then their demands or their wishes may not be met, and nothing can be done about that. When something happens, global demand change in an instant due to health, economic shift, social behaviors, or panic buying, right? And when it happens, it becomes a major issue or disruption to supply chain. We also have geopolitical risks, wars, sanctions, like the Russian-Ukraine war, that of the Iran and that of the Israel war, which has a maximum impact on the Strait of Hormuz, where there has been global issues in terms of our supply to oil, right? When such things happens, it affects the supply chain distributions. We also have climate and natural disasters. Natural disasters such as floods, storms, wildfires, all these when happens, supply chain easily becomes affected because one major transportation to supply chain is roads. And when this happens, when ports are flooded, when roads are blocked, everything, or it becomes a threat to the supply chain issue. Okay, again, public health and emergencies. Like I said, the COVID-19 issues, where the whole world was shut down, right? We all went on lockdown. And when such things happen, we have no option than to halt our supply chain supply. And then cyber risk, as I said in my presentation, we need not always to rely on the lean systems. We have to build more resilient ways to make our supply chain more flexible and respond to issues. In our quest to increase technology to improve our supply chain demands, we also open ourselves to a lot of cyber risk. Data platforms create vulnerabilities, and all these drivers contribute to supply chain disruptions. Next is a video on the key drivers of supply chain disruptions.
This is apropos. NATO Chief Mark Rutte says the military alliance is discussing the best way to reopen the strategic Strait of Hormuz, through which a large chunk of the world's oil supplies normally pass. But with the Gulf region handling over 26 million containers each year, the consequences of the current crisis extend well beyond energy. Analysts warn that prolonged disruption will have a direct impact on food production costs right around the world. Eliza Herbert has more.
Some 120 vessels usually transit through the Strait of Hormuz daily. But as the passage has become perilous, effectively blockaded by Iranian strikes, traffic has dropped by 97% since before the war. An estimated 3,200 vessels remain stranded in the Gulf. The international maritime community is concerned for their crews.
We've got hundreds of ships with 20,000 seafarers. That's the number that's being talked about, but actually that's a conservative number. It's probably going to be more than that. The vessels can't leave, they are actually trapped.
Another stalwart of the seas at risk of becoming collateral damage is the container. Some shipping groups have suspended bookings and are reserving the right to dump containers at nearby ports under a 19th century rule, costing their clients thousands of dollars in extra fees and risking stranded cargo, blocked terminals and further delays. Others are rerouting, but while only 5% of global goods travel through the strait, redirecting trade is complicated. Renewed fears of Houthi attacks in the Red Sea are threatening the Suez Canal, and remaining options between Europe and Asia require longer routes and therefore more fuel and higher charges. Within the Middle East, lorries are an alternative to move containers across land, but distances and border controls pose extra challenges and costs, especially for fresh produce companies often already plagued by thin profit margins. Businesses are describing the situation as chaos, with ripple effects likely to be felt by the consumer.
Well, to discuss all of this, we're joined now by Ibru Suruku Baljip, Assistant Professor in Circular Supply Chains at the School of Management at the University of Bradford. Thanks so much for being with us on the programme. As we saw there in that report, Ibru, shipping customers say the conflict has seen carriers adding thousands of euros in extra charges, dumping containers essentially wherever they can, often very far away from where they're supposed to be. What impact at this stage is all of this having on businesses?
Yeah, thanks. First of all, thanks for having me. So first of all, this would have a couple of impacts on the industry and the consumer prices. So I want to clarify one thing first. So when a war declared or a transit point is closed, under the standard legal framework governing the global shipping, the choice where the cargoes would be left, the choice effectively belongs to the carrier. So the customers in that case have very little choice, and we are also aware that because of this reason, the shippers and freight forwarders are also exposed to extra fees charged by the shipping companies because of their rerouting, changes in discharge ports and increased bunker prices. And the freight also increased. Freight rates are also increased because of a couple of reasons. First of all, the war risk insurances increased quite a lot. So before the war, it was around like 0.15 to 0.25%, but as of March 11, it jumped to up to 10%, especially if the ships have ties to UK or US or Israel. And in addition to that, the emergency bunker surcharges also increased and implemented, and conflict has caused massive spike in the bunker fuel prices. Like major hubs in Singapore, fuel prices have jumped like up to 30 to 40%.
So the video we just watched was specifically on geopolitical effects, geopolitical contributions to supply chain disruptions, where emphasis the video specifically spoke about the impact of the blockage of Strait of Hormuz as a result of the Israel-Iran war, right? That was what the video was explaining or making emphasis on, how it has affected our supply chain around the world, and then people calling and praying that the Strait of Hormuz open again for business to flow as usual. Now, we will be looking at the real world disruptions, the evidences, some real world situations that has happened and have a major impact on supply chain. One is about the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And this one, multi-tier ripple effect, factory closure, port blocks, empty shelves, right? PPE shortage exposed. That was the major impact of this COVID-19, and this greatly affected supply chain around the world, supply chain businesses around the world, right? And that's some lesson. Networks with zero buffer inventory were unable to respond. That's what companies that was lying on the lean and just-in-time systems of production with zero buffer, they were unable to bounce back, right? Because everything went on a halt. And that is why this presentation seeks to provide more resilient ways of delivering goods to our customers, having better resilient systems so that in the midst of such instances, companies will be able to withstand the shocks. We also be talking about the Suez Canal blockage. A 6-day blockade by a single 400 million vessel disrupted 400 plus ships. When this happened, there were over 400 plus ships that were affected, and you can imagine the impact. 10 billion in global trade halted per day, right? During the 6 day, every single day, there was about $10 billion global trade haltage. And then a company called Maersk alone lost $88.79 million, right? And the lesson here is that choke point dependency creates catastrophic single point of failure. So if you look at what happened with the Suez Canal blockade, we cannot but always have a resilient way, a variety, and always also better options in our transporting goods to our customers. And then another real world evidence is the global semiconductor shortage, where 9.7 million vehicles went unproduced globally in 2021. Ford as a company lost 1.3 billion. Volkswagen cut 9 shifts. That's the impact. And you could imagine a company cutting 9 shifts. You could imagine the impact on unemployment. Toyota slashed output by 40%. All right? Toyota slashed output by 40%. So if we are talking about a resilient way to supply chain management, it is a serious issue here. We should always have a resilient way of handling our global supply chain business. If not, when these disruptions happens, it affects impact. There's a strong impact on the economies, employment, and everything, right? And then the lesson here is that low-cost single sourcing creates systematic fragility across sectors. So this real-world example is a clear indication and evidence that we always have a variety. There should always be the need of varieties in conducting businesses. We should always have options to be able to withstand these shocks. We'll be looking at the video in relation to real-world examples.
Now it's one of the world's most important shipping routes, and it's blocked. A giant container ship ran aground in the Suez Canal after losing power. And at around 200,000 tons and over 400 meters long, the container, well, it's going to take some shifting. 50 ships a day normally pass through the canal, carrying 12% of the world's trade. So the pressure is really on to get her refloated. Here's Richard Galvin.
One of the world's biggest container ships blocking the Suez Canal, one of the world's most vital trade routes. The ship, operated by a Taiwanese company, Evergreen, heading north through the canal towards the Mediterranean when it lost all power and steering. So what are the reasons for this?
One of them is engine failure. You lose control due to engine failure. You would lose control due to a steering failure, or you would lose control, which appears to be the case here, because they have experienced high winds.
The dots here show the congestion that's already built up as other large ships and oil and gas containers arrive in the area, but can go no further. The position of Ever Given totally blocking the route. The 200,000-ton ship has now been stuck for 2 days. The ship's technical managers have ruled out any mechanical or engine failures as a cause of this incident. Work to refloat it continues, but so far has not been successful.
It's an unusual situation and it's a very dire one. This is the largest vessel ever to go aground in the Suez Canal, and she's gone sideways in the canal, blocking both north and south passage. It's going to have huge ramifications for global trade, especially between Asia and Europe.
Normally, 50 ships a day pass through the Suez Canal, providing up to 12% of world trade. The main alternative for ships travelling between Asia and Europe is around Africa, but this is a much longer route. Richard Galpin, BBC News.
So now, we'll be looking at innovation in focus, the digital supply chain twin. So what is a digital supply chain twin? A computerized model that mirrors the real-time state of supply chain network, combining historical data, live operational data, and disruption model to support proactive decision model making. So this is the model: real-time inputs, real-time data inputs, network model, disruption simulation, risk assessment, and decisions. If you look at my earlier presentation on the real-time happenings of supply chain, we realized the impact or the effects that some companies had due to the COVID-19, the blockade of the Suez Canal and the Strait of Hormuz. Now, BMW afterwards signed a semiconductor supply deal with Global Foundries after the shortage exposed the just-in-time vulnerability. Now, cold pharma chain, COVID-19 vaccines required real-time twin modeling of cold storage and transport to prevent spoilage after the COVID-19 happened. And then they realized that some vaccines need storage in order not to spoil. There was a redesigning of what? A cold storage transport to prevent it. And then MISEC, as I presented earlier, rerouted 69 vessels after the evergreen, that is what, the happening of the Suez Canal, to control tower visibility and enable rapid fleet reconfiguration. So after the real-time happening, some companies sat down to put in perspective some innovation strategies to be able to enable them to build more buffers to withstand shocks when indeed such situations happen again. So these are the challenges and trade-offs in building resilient network. As I said, the lane systems and the old system has always been about what? Minimizing cost, right? Minimizing cost. But finance team resists visible distraction threat. Semiconductor shortage proved that cost of not investing, right? And as I said, it is always not about the cost. But when it happened, they now realize what the cost of not investing. Now, operational complexity, more suppliers, routes, warehouses, and systems, it equals more coordination. Clear decision rules are important as the physical network design. We also look at data quality and integration as a challenge. And in this one, we need a digital twin, we need an AI and blockchain need accurate real-time data. Siloed systems and poor supply data produce wrong decisions in crisis, right? The challenge here is that data quality and integration. This has always been a challenge in building a strong, resilient network. And what this suggests is that we need to build a better system with AI and better blockchain need, in able to predict accurately when situations are about what happen. Partnership and participation. Resilience extends beyond focal firm. Blockchain and control towers need supply data, governance, incentives, and confidentiality agreement. Right? So partnerships, companies have to come together to form a solid partnership in always to finding solutions to such challenges. And then cyber security exposure. These are all challenges in building strong, resilient networks. As I said, technology has always been the way to go. But in our quest to always build better technologies to support supply chain, we also tend to expose ourselves to a lot of our cybersecurity exposure. And this is a challenge in building resilient network. However, we need better systems like the 4.0 technologies to introduce new interoperability challenges. And then also sustainability trade-offs. Some resilient strategies increase emissions and waste. Extra stock, redundant capacity, and reshoring can conflict with the ESG commitments, right? And these are challenges, right? Some strategies as we build on also tend to expose some effect to our environment, and therefore it's a challenge though, but we need to look at it in able to come up with the solutions that will help us build a more resilient network to aid our supply chain to be able to deliver our goods to our customers on time, and to always have better buffers in the midst of our shocks. Conclusions and recommendations. From the presentations, it has become clear that disruptions are now the norm, not exception in global logistics. As we intend to expand our logistical networks to the world and to more advanced places, we also need to agree with ourselves that disruptions are bound to happen. They are unpredictable. Geopolitical wars can happen in a minute. Climate change and natural disasters can happen in a minute. Health issues, global pandemics, they can all happen in a minute. And then no single strategy works. And therefore, firms need a portfolio of resilient strategies. We can build a strategy today. For example, we can build a more technological strategy today that seems to solve the current issue. But as I said, there can be a cybersecurity attacks that will bring us back to square one, back to the drawing board, to be able to come up with new strategies. And then technology support resilience, but only when backed with good data and governance, right? Technology, as I said, has always been the way to go. But we need good data, we need governance system, we need certain set rules and boundaries that will support this system to work. Based on this, I recommend a scenario-based network analysis where evaluate logistic network through disruption simulations, not just normal period cost models. We must understand how network behaves when a supplier fails, a port closes, or a system is attacked. So I recommend a scenario-based network analysis where we analyze everything and understand what happens when a port is closed or a system is attacked. We also must invest in an end-to-end data visibility. We must prioritize data standardization across suppliers and logistics service providers. Digital tools are only as good as the data flowing through them, especially beyond tier 1 suppliers. And my third recommendation is that we must treat resilience as strategic, not reactive, right? We must see a resilient network or a more robust system as a strategy and not reactive to systems or circumstances happening. We must build resilience before a crisis, right? We must always have a solution, a more robust system that if in the event of happenings, in the event of crisis, we might be able to withstand. Not during crisis, companies that embed resilience into their supply chain strategy will protect service levels, manage costs, and stay competitive in an uncertain world, right? If we are able to treat resilience as a strategy and not a reaction to situations and circumstances, companies will be able to manage costs, stay competitive in an uncertain world. So this is a video presentation on my conclusions and recommendations as presented earlier.
All right, moving on. Now, the global oil market is facing a double shock. OPEC has cut its demand outlook, citing the economic impact of the conflict. But even as demand is revised lower, supply is collapsing far more sharply, triggering a widening gap between how much the oil world needs and how much it can actually access. OPEC, which accounts for about 35 to 40% of total crude oil production, has lowered its global oil demand forecast for the second quarter by 500,000 barrels per day. But the bigger story is on the supply side. OPEC's crude production has plunged by a record 7.56 million barrels per day in March. That's a decline of nearly 25%. Iraq, Saudi Arabia and the UAE have all recorded steep output declines, highlighting the scale of disruption across key producers. These producers have now turned to alternative export lifelines. Saudi Arabia is ramping up flows through its east-west petrol line, routing crude into the Red Sea. The UAE is pushing exports via the Fujairah pipeline, bypassing Hormuz entirely. And Iraq continues to rely on its northern route through Turkey to access Mediterranean markets. But these alternatives come with limits. Combined, these pipelines can move roughly about 6 to 8.5 million barrels per day at best. That's significantly lower than the 20 million barrels per day that typically flows through the Strait of Hormuz. The disruption is hitting oil importing economies the hardest, especially in Asia. The reason is simple. It's the simple understanding of how the supply chain works.
Thank you, class. And this brings to an end my presentation on the logistic network design in an era of supply chain disruptions, as I present some strategies, innovations, and challenges. Once again, my name is Bismark, Amofa, and I thank you for your time.